All right, so now let's talk about this section right here, this unison section. This is kind of the money section of the UAD and why you get UAD. So whenever you buy an Apollo, twin, we'll just use that as an example because that's what I'm using right now. You have the ability to record your sound with really no noticeable latency, and so that was one of the biggest selling points for me. Is that when I used the previous preamp, and I won't really say their name, but that previous preamp I was using, I would always have to factor in latency whenever I had an artist performing, whether it had been singing or playing an instrument through it. And so a lot of times what would happen is that I would get you know um, I would get complaints that whatever they sang or whatever they played would have a delay between the time they played it and the time they could hear it in the headphones. And so that was problematic. So in order to try to remedy that is I would go through my DAW and lower the buffer size. And that would help with the latency a lot of times, but sometimes I'd introduce other things like cracks and pops because of the computer trying to process everything. And so then I have to increase the buffer size, and then that might allow the latency to be, kind of have a balance. I'd have to strike a balance between the latency and not getting the cracks and pops. And then sometimes I would still get the latency, even if I got the buffer size to a reasonable level. So it was just always something I always had to factor in. And so by getting UAD, it actually allowed me to not have those latency issues. The other part of that is this Unison section here is I can actually load in plugins that emulate vintage analog hardware. So right now I'm actually recording through a UA610B, which is an emulation of obviously the 610B, but it's a piece of hardware that was used in Ray Charles and Elvis and several other artists that use this preamp and use that, or not this exact preamp, but the hardware that this this plugin is emulating. So um, one thing to note is that whenever your hardware is used, I mean, if you go to a studio and you see a bunch of different pieces of hardware, all of those pieces of hardware serve a purpose, and those pieces of hardware have a specific sound and tonal characteristic. And so that's kind of one of the things that a lot of the engineers miss by when obviously the recording started, you started using Pro Tools and using it in the boxes, you missed a lot of the sonic characteristics that they would get off of their SSL board or off of like a Neve preamp and things. And so a lot of these third-party vendors have created plugins and that emulate those pieces of hardware, and UAD pretty much does it the best. And you have the ability to record through the plugins, the ones that are designated for Unison compatibility. So if I switch to, say, for instance, to a Neve 1073, which is one of the plugins that I purchased, you can notice that the tone of my voice actually sounded a little bit different than it sounded on the 610B. And that's because the Neve has a totally different sound than the 610B, and so it gives you the option to kind of have your sound or color your sound and change your tonal characteristics of your audio on the way in when you record, similar to what you would do if you went to a studio and you recorded through a real Neve preamp. So that's the cool part about using UAD, is you could get all these emulations of great pieces of classic analog hardware. And so the way a lot of these work, the way that UAD does it, is they emulate kind of all of the various stages of the preamp, because each one of these stages actually affects your color and your sound. So when I turn my input gain up, I actually can change the quality and of the sound that I have. So for instance, if I kick the input stage up here on this Neve to like this, then you notice that my sound, even though my volume, I'm trying to keep the volume the same so it's a fair fight, you notice that the sound of my voice actually sounds different. Like the texture sounds a little bit different. Kick it up a little bit more. So you notice that the tone of my voice actually sounds a little bit different. And that's actually kind of a benefit that I would not have if I just used a regular, a preamp without any ability to make that, change the color and characteristics on the way in. So let me turn this off. This is just the preamp from UAD, no signal. Let me turn off the compressor as well. So no coloration at all, and it still sounds really good. Don't get me wrong, but then when I kick this on and I can change the color a little bit, it's pretty cool to be able to do that before I even start mixing, and start with a great, sounding signal before I even start mixing. So that's what you get when you get UAD, is is the ability to emulate vintage analog hardware and the characteristics of the hardware on the way in on the recording. And so, uh, as I mentioned before, the color change is based off of kind of every one of these phases here. So, and the input stage here, my color changes. When I EQ, the color changes. And then probably one of the most important things is the impedance. So on the Neve here, the impedance is actually affected when you change the switch here. So if I change it to low here, it actually changes my impedance to a lower impedance. I believe it's like 300 ohms when it's set to here, and then it's 1.2k ohms when it's set to here. So you notice that the color of my voice actually changed, quite a bit. Maybe a little bit more like top end when it's on low, when the ohms is a little bit lower, and it sounded maybe like my voice got a little bit louder as well. So let's go back to the 610B and see what happens when we change the ohms on the 610B, and then we'll bring the video to a close here. So the ohms on the 610B is actually, or the impedance rather, is actually affected here. So if I change the impedance to 500 and lower it, it actually sounds again like my voice got a little bit more top end frequencies. And so you actually, you obviously want to affect this and change this based off of the microphone you're using. Some microphones, may have an different EQ curve, and a different, tonal characteristic, bigger diaphragm, things of that nature. And so all of these things are, obviously you just want to tweak your sound based off of, whichever, audio source you have running through, as well as maybe even your microphone and the hardware you're using to, run into the preamp. So don't just, create a preset and think that this preset is going to work on every mic, on every singer that you have coming through, because it just may not be true. So what you want to do when you start recording is test out different microphones on the singers. And I know this is getting a little bit away from how to use your UAD Apollo Twin, but I'm just giving you a little bit of information. Test out different microphones on your, singers, on instruments. See how it responds. If you have the bandwidth to do it, and the patience, and the artist has enough patience to work with you on it, test them out and say, hey, can I try this microphone out on you, and to see if this sounds better on you, and then let me see if I can tweak up, the sound a little bit, and see if I can, because I want to make sure you get the best sound when we record. So just things like that. So that's in a nutshell, I know I went on a tangent here, but this is what you get when you buy the UAD, and get into buying UAD and getting the plugins, is the ability to modify your sound and get it kind of sounding very close to what the analog hardware would sound like when you record, if you were to go to a studio, or if you bought the real hardware. So based off of what I outlined here, do you think getting UAD is worth it? What are your comments on it? Like, write some comments to me and let me know what you think about what I've shown here. Is there anything that you wanted me to show a little bit more of? So either way, that's pretty much it.